Hi guys, welcome to this lecture video on ecology. Ecology is the study of interactions amongst organisms. So organisms interacting with other organisms, and also how organisms interact with their environment. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture video. First, I want to start off with abiotic factors. So we can talk about abiotic factors as non-living parts of the organism's environment. So A means without, biotic means living, right? Life. So basically, abiotic means without life. So these are all factors within the environment that are not living, or non-living parts of the environment. Examples would include salinity, temperature, wind, humidity, pH, sunlight, the amount of nutrients that are available, and certain types of pollution as well. Biotic factors in an environment are going to be the living aspects of the environment. This is going to include the organisms that live within the ecosystem, that make up the ecosystem. So we're talking about not only plants and animals, but also bacteria. We're talking about single cellular organisms, as well as very complex organisms like you and me. So these are all going to be biotic factors, or the living components of the environment. So now I want to talk about the different levels of life. So I want to start with the individual here. So here we have an organism, or one individual Mexican gold poppy. Then in the other picture, you can see a population of Mexican gold poppies. And a population is a group of organisms of the same species interacting together. So keywords for population is a group of organisms that are of the same species that are interacting together in an area. That's a population. A community. This picture here is a community. If we are talking about multiple species of organisms in the area interacting together. So here we have the cacti, we have the Mexican gold poppies, we also have these lovely purple flowers. There are probably birds in this environment, there's bacteria, other organisms that are living in this area, and they're all interacting together. That would be a community. So multiple organisms of different species interacting together as a community. Now, if we add in abiotic factors, it becomes an ecosystem. So basically a community and the abiotic factors in that area are going to make up an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is going to be all of the different species in this area interacting together, along with those abiotic factors, including temperature, pH, sunlight, salinity, nutrients, minerals, things like that. That would make up the ecosystem. And then the biosphere is going to include all of the ecosystems on Earth. So you've got the rainforest ecosystem, you have the desert ecosystem, you have the tundra ecosystem, and when you put them all together, that makes up the biosphere, or all of the ecosystems on Earth. So these levels of life, the first one where we start to include abiotic factors in the environment would be at the ecosystem level. Biodiversity is the variety of organisms on Earth, and it is essential to have a great variety of organisms on Earth, because It's hard to take away one species or two species and not have effects on other organisms. So basically what I'm getting at is if we lower biodiversity or the variety of organisms on Earth, it's going to have tremendous effects on other organisms. And so here I ponder the question, which species would you need to take with you to the moon to make life habitable? Well, you're going to want to take probably plants, right? We're going to need plants or phytoplankton. We're going to need a way to get oxygen. Well, those plants also will rely on certain organisms, like some of those plants might rely on bees, for example, for pollination. So we'd need to take bees with us. If you plan on eating any type of meat, you definitely would need to take an organism for that. And then you have to think about, well, what's going to control these populations so that they don't get out of control? So that's another aspect. To which species would you need to take with you to the moon to make life habitable? Really, each species relies on another species, and we rely on them to make sure that population numbers are sustained. All the interactions together of species with each other and their environment is going to be really important. So biodiversity is very important. And there are factors that make up biodiversity. Two of those factors are species diversity and genetic diversity. And species diversity is the number or the variety of species on Earth. Well, a species is made up of a set of genes. It determines the species. It determines the organism. The genes determine the organisms in the population are the species. So without genetic diversity, if we decrease genetic diversity, we're going to also decrease species diversity. If we lose certain genes that make up certain organisms, we're going to lose that species. And when we lose that species, we're losing overall biodiversity on Earth. And the loss of that species may mean that another species eats that one that's gone, and now it has no food resources. So we've lost another species and therefore lowered biodiversity even more. An example of the loss of a species and also of genetic diversity, a really good example is the gastric brooding frog. This organism was native to Australia until logging became very popular in its habitat. So basically they started logging, and on top of that there was also a fungus disease that also helped to wipe out the population. But why was this organism so interesting? Well, that's because it's a gastric brooding frog. So it was able to birth its young through its mouth, which is super, super cool. What would happen was the eggs were actually fertilized externally, and then she would take about 40 of these eggs into her mouth and she would swallow them. That means that it would go down, these eggs would then end up in her stomach, where they would stay for 6 weeks. And you're probably wondering how eggs were able to survive in such an acidic environment in the stomach. Well, that's because these specific eggs had a coating on them that stopped the secretion of hydrochloric acid from her parietal cells in her stomach. So the acid that usually would be secreted was not, and therefore it was a place where these eggs could be stored for 6 weeks. which is really, really neat. That this particular egg had the ability to turn off the parietal cells in the stomach and stop the secretion of the hydrochloric acid that helps to keep that pH low. So we could have really learned a lot about this organism and possibly applied it to human medicine. But however, now it's extinct due to humans taking away the habitat, and also a fungal disease that helped to wipe it out as well. But here you can see after that 6-week period, she would actually burp the babies out, and they would be little juveniles at that point. Pretty cool frog. Okay. I talked about already one example of declining biodiversity, which is habitat loss. And so I put the pelican on here from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And while that portion of the ocean is still there, there's a lot of pollution, obviously, to that habitat. And we may not know the effects of that immediately, but a lot of times the effects of habitat loss and pollution, another example here as well, and pollution can be shown many years after the cleanup process has happened and everything. That's when sometimes you can start to see the effects. The lower picture down here, this is another example of pollution. And it is a picture of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Basically, there is a area of water in the Pacific Ocean where all of these currents kind of circle around, make this large circle. And within the middle, where there's no currents, is a collection of all of these pieces of plastic. And all of this plastic comes from being thrown into rivers and streams, and it makes its way to the ocean and then gets out of these currents and into this large area. And it's pretty sad, honestly, because what happens with all this plastic is the sun actually breaks it down into tiny, tiny pieces, and then organisms come in and eat the plastic that's in the water, and they become full because they think they're full whenever actually they can't get any nutrients from the plastics. And so you can cut open organisms that have died from this, and you can actually see all the teeny tiny little plastics that were in their stomach. It's actually pretty sad. If you'd like to know more about that, you can check out the online environmental biology course that I teach, Bio 140, in the spring. We talk a lot about the pollution and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Over here at the top, we have overharvesting. So as you can see, a lot of reasons for declining biodiversity are because of human interactions with the environment. And here we like to harvest, obviously, for food purposes. However, overharvesting historically has been an issue with lowering populations to the point of them becoming endangered, and then sometimes even extinct. So here, that's why we have certain fishing regulations. Unfortunately, not all countries abide by or enforce, I guess I should say, rather, enforce such strict fishing regulations like the U.S. does. But a few things for the fishing regulations is the size of the fish matters. So if it's not big enough, or there's a certain size usually. If it's not a certain size, then you're not it's not eligible to be caught. You have to throw it back. Also, if it is not an adult, so you can't catch juveniles who haven't had an opportunity to reproduce. They also limit certain times of the year for fishing seasons as well. Down here in the right hand corner, you can see the lionfish and the yellow star thistle. I think plants a lot of times get left out, so I like to include those in my lectures. I think people really enjoy animals a lot, but plants are pretty cool too. So these two organisms, however, are not cool because they are an invasive species in North America. So the lionfish is actually native to the Indo-Pacific, and it has exploded. Its populations have exploded in the Caribbean because of these spines that are poisonous. So it doesn't have any predators in the Caribbean, and it is eating a lot of native fish. So what we have tried to do to prevent this exponential growth of these things in the Caribbean is you can actually go down there and hunt them for sport. Or you can hunt them and to be filleted and cooked. And so right now there's a big demand for chefs to try to use lionfish in the Caribbean so that there's a large demand and we can take a lot of them out of the population for food and as well as sport to try to lower their population numbers. Down here, the yellow star thistle is actually native to Europe, but is an invasive species here in North America and can be found in Oregon, Northern California. And the yellow star thistle actually has a neurotoxin within it when a horse eats it. So these are typically found on ranches, and horses will develop what's called chewing disease. And with chewing disease, the neurotoxin affects the brain of the horse and also certain muscles within the horse. So the horse eats food, but it cannot swallow the food. So the horse becomes quite fatigued. It basically starves to death because it cannot get nutrients. So it's called a chewing disease because they continually chew, however they can't swallow. Sometimes when they drink water, their muzzle will actually get, they can actually get down in under the water and end up drowning themselves as well. They just have a loss of control of their muscles and especially facial muscles. And so this is really sad, actually, chewing disease. There's no cure for it, and it's not reversible. So once a horse has ingested the yellow star thistle and starts to get symptoms of the chewing disease, the neurotoxin taking its effect on the horse, the best option for it is to be put down, which is sad. But a native, like I said, it's native to Europe, so but becomes invasive here because it also doesn't have predators, and it outcompetes a lot of other organisms, native organisms. And biological control, basically what this is sometimes we can use organisms to control other populations. So we can take one population and try to control another. Sometimes it works out for the best and it's useful, and everything goes okay according to plan. And sometimes it's actually detrimental. Um, so biological control is quite controversial. A lot of planning and research needs to go into it before using biological control as a method to control populations of organisms. So if you will watch these two videos for me, you're going to watch about the cane toads, and this is a biological control method gone wrong. And you're also going to watch a video about the parasitic wasps and aphids and how their relationship is actually working out for the British government. So go ahead and you can click back to those lecture videos. Those YouTube links are actually posted under the lecture videos folder for you. It's a really cool watch. We're going to start talking about community ecology and how different populations of organisms interact with each other. And we're going to start off with a symbiosis, and basically that's an interaction amongst two different organisms. Sometimes it is benefiting both organisms, sometimes one is benefited and the other is neither helped nor harmed, and then sometimes that one organism actually lives in or on the other organism and actually harms it. So we're going to go through those three different types of symbiosis. So we're going to start off with mutualism. Here you have Marlin and Nemo in their sea anemone. This is going to be an example of mutualism. Here, both organisms are going to benefit from the relationship. You have the clownfish here, which is receiving shelter and protection from the sea anemone. So these tentacles that you see here will have stinging cells called nematocysts, and these nematocysts protect the home or the sea anemone, which is the home to these clownfish, and they also protect the clownfish by stinging any thing that comes in contact with them. And so most organisms are going to want to avoid the sea anemone because if they don't want to get stung by these stinging cells or these nematocysts on the tentacles of the sea anemone. So the clownfish gets protection, and it also gets a place to live. What does the clownfish do for the sea anemone? Well, it provides it with nutrients through waste products, and it also helps with filtering. So the sea anemone will be feeding via a filtering mechanism through the water, and so moving the tentacles around, swimming in and out, swimming around within the sea anemone, that's going to help circulate the water and therefore help the sea anemone be able to feed. Also, butterfly fish, a different species of fish from the clownfish here, actually enjoy eating the sea anemone, and so the clownfish actually scare away the butterfly fish from eating the sea anemone. So they'll poke out of it whenever a butterfly fish comes around and tries to eat the sea anemone, which is quite funny that the clownfish scares the butterfly fish away. So clowns are scary here in this example. Here's an example with plants, because I think plants sometimes don't get enough credit for being just as clever as animals. And this is the acacia tree. It grows in Africa, which is its habitat. And then these are acacia ants. And what the acacia tree provides for the ant is a place to live. So if you look at this diagram over here, you can see these little holes in the thorns of the acacia tree, and that's where the ants actually live. Now, the acacia tree not only provides a home for the ants, but it also provides food. So if you look here, you can see these little balls here of sugars that the plant will actually make and give to the ant for food. So the ant gets shelter and it gets food from the acacia tree. The acacia ants help the tree by attacking any enemies. For example, giraffes like to feed on these leaves of the acacia tree. And so when the giraffe goes to feed on the leaves of the acacia tree, the ants will actually attack the giraffe. Also, the ants will attack other plants that are competing for sunlight, water, for example, within a certain area of the acacia tree. So what you'll notice when you look at these acacia trees is you'll see that the tree is kind of by itself. There's not a lot of other shrubs growing around it, basically, because these ants will attack and destroy plants that are trying to outcompete the acacia tree because it provides them with a lovely home and food. Commensalism, I love this example. These small fish you see here are what we call remoras, and I love this little bumper sticker here. My other shark is a great white. And so hopefully you get a laugh out of that too. But basically what these remoras do is they swim here. Notice they're swimming back behind the pectoral fin of the shark, and they swim along for protection. The shark provides them with protection. Also, when the shark feeds, it will thrash its food about to break it up into smaller pieces, and the remoras can feed on that as well. And so the remoras get protection and food by hanging out here with the shark. However, the shark is really not benefited from the relationship here with the remora, and it's not really harmed either. So this is an example of commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. Parasitism. This is probably the most exciting example of a symbiosis. Usually the organism lives in or on a host, and that host then is harmed. And parasites typically get nourishment from the host. So we discussed the parasitic wasp earlier and how it actually lays its egg, or basically young, inside that aphid, and then the young keeps the vital organs of the aphid alive until the wasp is then ready to hatch out, which is a great example of parasitism. It's actually living inside that aphid and then getting nutrients by feeding on the aphid, and then keeping all of those vital organs alive until it's ready to hatch out of the aphid. Another example here is something you'll decorate your house with at Christmas time. Little do you know, but you're actually kissing beneath a semi-parasite. Now, when it's in your house, it's obviously not being a semi-parasite, but if you go out in the wintertime is when it's really easy to see mistletoe in a tree like this one here. You'll see these big green balls while the tree is not got leaves on it. You'll see that these really big green balls, and that's mistletoe. And mistletoe is considered a semi-parasite because it gets its nutrients from the tree. So the tree will provide it unwillingly. The tree does not want to, but basically the mistletoe will get its nutrients from the tree, but it also has the capability of doing photosynthesis and providing its own nourishment as well. And so, therefore, we call it a semi-parasite. Okay, predators. We have two different types. We have sit and wait and moving in search of prey. A sit and wait predator is good because it uses less energy to capture prey. Example of that would be the spider here. However, a negative to being a sit and wait predator is you would have limited resources. You have to wait for your prey to come along. It's not guaranteed that prey will come along at certain intervals of time. You may go a long period of time without a prey coming in contact with you, and so therefore you may go hungry. Moving in search of prey, predators, a positive or a pro about that is you get prey when you want it. You look for it and you go after it, right? You see something tasty and you head for it. You don't sit and you don't wait for that something tasty to come to you. And then a negative would be you do expel a lot of energy moving in search of your prey. Here I put an example of a cheetah on here because they use a lot of energy. They use fast bursts of energy to be able to capture their prey. Let's talk about prey mechanisms. So we have cryptic coloration, which is basically camo here, which you can see the chameleon doing here for the Valspar commercial. I absolutely love this. I think it's such a clever way to advertise paint. I mean, who would have thought a chameleon? And basically, if you haven't seen the commercial, she tries on, so basically she walks up to these different colored paints, and of course she is trying to blend in with the paint, and so her skin color changes to the color of the paint, and she's like, hey honey, what do you think about this blue? What do you think about this green? So clever by Valspar to use the chameleon there. So that's cryptic coloration. Then you have disruptive coloration, which is what you see here with the zebras. If you've ever wondered why zebras have stripes, one reason is because it is harder to distinguish a single individual apart. And so the coloration helps them when they are in a herd to not be able to be easily identified or singled out by the predator. And then my last two examples here, this is a poisonous dart frog. And then you also have the poisonous newt here, red newt. And these are going to be warning colorations. So you can see that they're brightly colored, which you would think that would not be advantageous in blending in with the environment. However, they're brightly colored to warn predators that, hey, I'm toxic, I'm poisonous, and so therefore, if you eat me, you will die, so stay away. And a quick fun fact for you here, this red newt has a neurotoxin that actually paralyzes the respiratory muscles. And so once you can't get oxygen, you'll have multiple organ failure. And so this red newt is actually a really, really cool organism. One of my favorites to talk about in class, actually. A couple of hikers out in Oregon actually boiled one of these guys in their coffee pot. I'm not sure if it was just accidentally put in there or if they meant to boil it in their coffee. My guess is an accident, but they actually died from doing that. If you were to touch one of these, you would be fine, but if you ingest it, their toxin, it is lethal. mimicry. So one of these snakes is deadly. It also contains a neurotoxin, which attacks your nervous system and causes paralyzation of muscles, like the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles. And so, which one of these do you think is venomous, and which one do you think is harmless? If you said the one on the left is venomous, you would be correct. So that is actually the eastern coral snake, native here to North Carolina. If you've ever heard of red and yellow, kill a fellow, red and black, a friend of Jack. Sorry, guys. Then that's how you can tell whether the snake is actually venomous or not. But over here, you have on the right, you have the scarlet king snake, and notice how its coloration and patterns are very similar to the venomous eastern coral snake. However, here you have red and black touching each other, whereas with the eastern coral snake that's venomous, you have red and yellow touching each other. It's a good idea if you're not sure not to pick either one of these up. But I have held the scarlet king snake before. They're absolutely lovely. But yes, I definitely don't want to touch an eastern coral snake. But the scarlet king snake here is using mimicry as a mechanism to deter its prey. And if you're a hawk flying over, you can imagine that it's really hard to distinguish the two of these apart if you are far away. And if you're a hawk and you're flying over and you're like, oh yeah, my friend Bob over here, he didn't live very long last time he attacked one of those. So they learn to stay away from those reddish yellow things, slithering things down there on the ground. And so that's one way that that organism protects itself, by mimicry. Keystone species. I love sea otters. Are they not the cutest organisms ever? I would just love to keep one of these as a pet. They are so adorable. And here you can see that the sea otters eat sea urchins. Yes, I know. You would think, why would that be tasty? But it is for sea otters. Sea otters eat sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. I don't know if you are familiar with big kelp beds out in California, but if you off the California coast, but if you look here, you can actually see how thick this kelp is in reference to the sea otter. And so there are really large kelp beds. You actually have to be very careful when diving in kelp beds because you can get wrapped up in the kelp. And these kelp beds that sea urchins feed on are actually home to fish and provide fish with shelter, especially young juvenile fish with shelter and habitat, because larger predators are not able to easily maneuver through these kelp beds. And so it's really a great fish nursery, if you will, these large kelp beds. And so a keystone species is a species in which if we remove the species, it will have drastic effects on the ecosystem. And so it's really key to the survival of the ecosystem. And so if we take out sea otters, what's that going to do to the sea urchin population? Yep, sea urchins are going to increase because there's no predators. And so if sea urchin populations increase, what's that going to do to the kelp beds? Decrease the kelp beds. And so therefore, if we decrease the amount of kelp because the sea urchins eat it all, then we're also going to decrease the number of fish because it provides the fish with home and shelter and habitat. And so it can really drastically affect an ecosystem if we remove the keystone species. The keystone species is really key to the survival of that ecosystem. You'll notice that if the keystone species is removed, a lot of times the ecosystem can change drastically. Vegetation can change. In the case of the wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, that's another example of keystone species. The vegetation actually changed because they were eating the elk. The elk were no longer foraging as much on the vegetation, increased vegetation, changed the flow of the rivers. And so it can really, really damage an ecosystem or affect an ecosystem if you remove a keystone species. Or in that case, a keystone species was reintroduced to the area, and it was actually beneficial for Yellowstone National Park. All right, so organisms that produce their own food, that do photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, that make their own food are called producers. And so they always start out at the bottom, the lowest trophic level here. So in these two examples, you can see grass and you also see phytoplankton. And those would be your producers here. And then the organisms that eat the producers are called primary consumers. So these are largely herbivores. They eat the plants or the phytoplankton or algae here. This would be zooplankton over here eating the phytoplankton. And the grasshopper eating the grass would be your primary consumer. Then the organism that eats the primary consumer is considered the secondary consumer. They feed on primary consumers. The tertiary consumer feeds on the secondary consumer. And the quaternary consumer feeds on the tertiary consumer. And usually you will only have about 5 trophic levels at max, just because of the amount of energy that's passed from trophic level to trophic level, which is what we're going to talk about in just a minute. So make sure you can identify primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and the producers if given an example. Okay, population ecology. You can see that the distribution of organisms in a population is not always equal. If it's uniform, which we have over here with penguins, basically the organisms in the population are distributed uniformly. So they have about the same amount of space between each other. Over here, you can see a school of fish. These are referred to as clumped distribution because they clump together, and that's a mechanism to evade predation here. And then lastly, we have random distribution or dispersion method here, because what happens when wildflowers and a lot of plants have a random dispersion pattern, because they are just releasing their seeds into, a lot of them are wind-based mechanism, and so they're just releasing their seeds into the wind, and wherever the wind takes them is where those organisms are going to land and grow. And so it is random there. Exponential growth This is when populations do not have any limiting factors. So there's plenty of resources, there's abundant resources, and the populations are able to just grow exponentially. There's no limiting factors or anything like that. And exponential growth you might also see as a J. You can see this J shape. So a lot of times we will discuss it as the J-shaped curve. Human population right now is experiencing exponential growth. We haven't run out of food or space to cause us to switch to a different type of growth, which is next. Logistic growth. This is an S-shaped curve. And as you can see here, and this dotted line that you see is what we call a carrying capacity. And a carrying capacity is the environment's limits, basically, on sustaining a population. So that population, once it hits that carrying capacity, is going to level off. Because maybe there's no more food in that available in that ecosystem, or maybe there's not enough shelter, or maybe there's large predation going on. Maybe even there is a natural occurrence like a fire or a hurricane or something like that that limits the population. So basically with the carrying capacity, this is the maximum number of a species here that the environment can really support.